What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. That's right. This is the #1 podcast for theological ingredients. We try to bring you some of the best of the academy, put it in your earbuds, and let you wrestle, reflect, grow, be transformed, or just think it's wrong and crazy. You know, I know that because I've gotten some emails recently from a collection of people that you might say are in the fundamentalist Christian variety who enjoy listening to this podcast as a form of torture. And they've emailed me to let them let me know about it. But, but they are the few in the minority. The rest of you, I'm sure, are going to be enjoying this conversation I have with Michael J. Murray. He is a philosopher, theologian, regularly engaged in the interchange between religion and science. And that's what we end up talking about quite a bit in this conversation. It was a ton of fun. I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you. Also, we recorded it right as he was finishing his time at the Templeton Foundation and has recently become the president of the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, which, if you're like me and you have children and you watch PBS, you know that they support PBS. So basically, on top of his, scholarship in religion and science, now he's going to be part of securing financial support for PBS, which I basically think that's a way to make every parent in the country love you. That's just an aside. So thank you, Michael, for that. Before we jump into the podcast, I wanted to give a few announcements. One announcement, it's not too late to join the Homebrewed Christianity summer class with Jack Caputo on theology of culture. All you got to do is go to johndcaputo.com. We just talked about Tillich. Coming up next is Mary Daly, James Cone. Then we're going to talk about how technology is changing humanity. And all you got to do is go to johndcaputo.com. Number 2, we just announced, like right now, this is the first time on the podcast, an event this fall in Cary, North Carolina, September 27th to 28th, called to be Prophets. And I'm going to be joined by my friend, Brian McLaren. Ooh, my soul partner, my intellectual facilitator of all sorts of growth in my life, challenging me, reflecting with me, and one of my favorite people to share a brew with, Robin Henderson Espinoza. And I'm super excited about this. My friend Dan Pugh, who is a minister at Christ the King Lutheran Church, it's a ELCA church, progressive church there in Cary that's hosting the event. He said, look, if Brian and Robin are coming, I want my favorite professor from divinity school to come, and that is Steve Davison. He's a Hebrew Bible scholar and does post-colonial wrestling with the Hebrew Bible text. So you're going to get the activist theologian, Robin Henderson Espinoza, the post-colonial prophetic Hebrew Bible engagement from Steve Davison. You're going to get Brian McLaren, and then you're going to get all the fun that happens at a homebrewed event. That's right, September 28th, or 27th and 28th in Cary, North Carolina. I want to give a shout out to Lynn Robinson and Dawn Longshore. They joined the Homebrewed Christianity community recently. They went to homebrewedcommunity.com. They joined up. They donate each month. They get access to all sorts of stuff, which we're just a few weeks away from launching for our members their own podcast feed where they'll get additional episodes and such. And for those that are like elders, they're going to be getting all the lectures through an intro to systematic theology class I'm developing. And this is an intro to all the major figures and schools of thought in the 20th century. Things that, if you listen to the podcast, just get assumed by lots of scholars. I've been trying to collect questions, things people send. What is the background stuff that could really help you dig more, dig deeply into the conversations that are here if you aren't, someone that went to school, and spent all this time studying it. So I'm creating this ongoing lecture series, kind of class thing for the Homebrewed Christianity elders. To do so, you can get access to that just by going to homebrewedcommunity.com. All right. So as we're joining this conversation I had with Michael Murray, just want to let you know this episode is sponsored by none other than the new Revised Standard version of the Bible. Now, I know you know the NRSV if you're a Bible nerd, right? Because it's basically the translation all the biblical scholars think you should use. But normally, the NRSV comes in a form that looks much more like I don't want to say it negatively because I love the classroom, but a classroom text, this big, thick thing, not pretty, not comfortable, not ease of use. Well, Zondervan's just come out with a whole line of different NRSV Bibles that are actually created to be easier to read, easier to use, easier to hold. They're like NRSV Bibles, the nerdy translation, the one that scholars want, and ones you could actually use in your personal life and regularly engage it outside of, that kind of classroom context. And I know this is an issue because I have my NRSV Bible I kept from undergrad and then in through divinity school and such. And it has all my notes and everything in it from all those classes I took and student loans I incurred. And I don't want to get rid of it. But I've had to rewrap the thing multiple times. I've gotten it redone so that it now is a little easier to use and function and stuff. And because there was never an NRSV one to go get that was easy to use, easy to hold, and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to check it out, go to newrevisedstandard.com. Who doesn't love a sponsor of the podcast that makes nerdy translation of the Bible easier to use? So yeah, shout outs to Zondervan for doing it. newrevisedstandard.com. All right. All that said, enjoy this conversation. Boom. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, we have Michael Murray, who's here. He's the author of a whole bunch of different religion and science books, including Nature, Red in Tooth and Claw, Divine Evil. He edited with Jeffrey Schloss, the Believing Primate, and works with the Templeton Foundation, which for those of you that don't hang out in the academic world, is intimately invested in the terrain of religion, science, education, and are a part of facilitating, hosting all sorts of projects, publishing work, events, and things like that. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So when you think of the questions that come up in religion and science, like what was the first one that came on your radar that really inspired or provoked you to become a scholar and leader in the area?
Oh, okay. Well, it's interesting. I became a Christian when I was a senior in high school and was an avid science geek at that time as well. When I was planning to go to college and be a chemistry major. And in fact, that's what I started off doing when I got there. So I was really interested in scientific issues right from the very beginning. And I think like a lot of people who became Christians around the time that I did in the late 70s, early 80s, the evolution issue was really big. And so that was the first topic that I really confronted. I'm not sure that that's the thing that led me to want to go on and become a Christian scholar, but it was certainly the thing that ignited my interest in issues at the intersection of science and faith.
Mm-hmm. And when you, in your kind of early life as a Christian, like where in the church would you have located yourself in? Like how did that community, what were their common assumptions around the relationship of religion and science?
Yeah, so the church that I attended in Connecticut when I was in high school was really conservative evangelical. And so this was a church that probably consisted mostly of people who were anti-evolution. I don't really know if there were like a lot of young earth creationist types in the congregation, but I wouldn't be surprised. So these were people who took a pretty literal reading of the Genesis narrative and didn't have much patience for, I think science more generally, but evolution certainly in particular.
Mm-hmm. And when one of the things I've been running into, just because I was a church planter's kid, which meant you always went to a church where your parents were at, even though they were Baptist church planters. Science was always something that was encouraged. I asked questions early on in middle school. We're given a book about cosmology and then ask questions about biblical criticism. And my dad's like, this is a book about the historical Jesus and things. So I've, in doing a lot of the interviews for the podcast, I've realized that there's, across, evangelicalism, there's different relationships with what questions are on or off the table. And one of the things I really value about your work is that there aren't questions that are off the table. Right. So how did you come, or how do you describe a more evangelical faith that doesn't take questions off the table or make them boundary issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think especially with the conservative evangelical audience, most of the members of that community really do believe that all truth is God's truth. So whether it's truth that we learn from the pages of Scripture, or it's truth that we learn through observing the creation, it's all truth that is rooted in God. And if we're looking at the sources of evidence we have available to us in ways that are not unreasonably biased or ideologically driven, then we can just take what we find at face value and ask, how do all the different pieces of the puzzle cohere? And so I think, if you can approach these issues without an axe to grind, and in ways that aren't driven by trying to come to some predetermined conclusion, I think that kind of humility is something that's respected by those within the evangelical community and those outside of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, so when you in your academic studies, when or what was the questions that kind of pulled you into a life of wrestling with the terrain of religion and science?
So I think I probably early on got interested in, after going through my undergraduate days and thinking about issues of evolution and creation and that sort of thing, I became really intrigued with a lot of the work that was going on in fine-tuning, looking at whether or not the sort of the constraints in terms of the laws and constants that govern the cosmos indicate that the universe seems to be set up in a special way that makes it suitable for the emergence of life and intelligent life. I'm still intrigued by that literature, but I think I also, like a lot of conservative Protestants, was also interested in looking at areas of tension, and I had seen a few. The first that became a real research program for me was the one that led to the Nature Ridden Tooth and Claw book, and that is how to think about animal pain and suffering and death and predation and extinction, especially in evolutionary time, in light of the theodicies that are traditionally deployed to try to understand the problem of evil. If you think of things like the free will defense and so on, it's just a real struggle to explain how those sorts of theodicies can work to explain animal suffering. And this actually came up in the context. I was teaching a senior level philosophy of religion course at Franklin and Marshall, and one of the students said, "Well, I'm really puzzled about this," and raised this question. How can you explain, why would an all good God permit innocent animals, over millennia to suffer? How's that compatible with God's goodness? And I thought, I haven't really seen any, but I can't remember reading anything about that. And I said, what? Let's just put that on hold. I'm going to go do some homework and come back and so I did go back and do some homework, and I found there really was very little that was written on the topic. At least very little that was written outside of the late 19th century. There's kind of an interesting historical story, I think, to tell about why this discussion about animal suffering kind of went on hold for the early part of the 20th century. But anyway, it was that led me to go back and want to spend some real time thinking about that, what I still think is a very difficult topic.
Mm-hmm. So when you have your undergrad students or are traveling around as part of your work with the Templeton Foundation and introducing the landscape of science and religion, what are the common assumptions about that relationship that need to be dispelled or you find problematic for a real fruitful exchange?
Well, I think there are two, and so those who are familiar with science and religion discussion won't hear really anything new in what I'm about to say, but I think there are two different challenges. So on the one hand, there are those who, following people like Stephen Jay Gould, just see science and religion as part of two distinct domains, non-overlapping, not interacting. And so they're uninterested in this discussion because they just don't think these two areas really have anything to do with each other. And I think that's a myth that needs to be dispelled. And I think it's actually pretty easily dispelled. I think the only way you can sustain that view is if you think that religion just concerns normative things, like what's good and what's bad. And if that's what you think, then maybe it's true that science really can't speak to that. Although even there, I'm not confident that that's right. But, generally speaking, empirical matters and normative matters, we kind of think of those as different things. Empirical matters tell us how the world is. Normative matters tell us how things are supposed to be. But of course, very few religious traditions stop at just the normative claims, right? They also make substantive claims about things like God created the heavens and the earth. Jesus was God incarnate. Jesus turned water into wine, right? These are all empirical claims. And once you acknowledge that those claims are part of religion, then you realize the potential for engagement between these two areas is real. I think the other is, again, with the more conservative evangelical audience, they find that, or they believe that scientists are ideologically driven in the work that they do. So their reasoning is biased and therefore can't be taken seriously or can't be taken at face value. So they spend a lot of time trying to unearth the ideological presuppositions that they think underlie this scientific work. And once they think they've figured out what the ideological view is, then it gives them license to just dismiss the conclusions. And that's where I think, it's helpful to have exemplars within the scientific community of serious religious thinkers, whether they're Christians or Jews or Muslims or whatever, right, who can help those communities to see, look, it's not about ideology, right? We're just doing the best we can to reason from the empirical data that we have to the conclusions that data seems to license.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, I've had this thought just from my experience working in congregations on the East and West Coast, that one of the things you see around these issues in mainline Protestantism is that because the most vocal voices on behalf of science are the more zealous ones who may not be able to pass an intro to philosophy class, but nonetheless, they're there, and the tendency or the theological inheritance for mainline Protestants is very Kantian in the sense that when they say God is creator, it actually is more discussing the structure of ethics than cosmology. Yeah. That you end up assuming that imaginary ideology that conservative Christians have about science is true, and that you should too. And so you end up with a whole section of the church that is open to science, and then the result is they just don't talk about God, or when they do, they cross their fingers, and they're basically like functional deist with a Jesus flavored ethics or something. Yeah. And so I think in both parts of the church, neglecting the religion and science conversation leads to problematic assumptions that really deflate the robust affirmations we're wanting to make as people of faith.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. And in especially in mainline communities, but I think you see this in other places as well. If you ask folks, well, what are the most pressing issues, or what are the most interesting issues when it comes to science and faith or science and theology, they're not pointing to the sorts of things that are the bread and butter for like the John Templeton Foundation, thinking about creation and evolution, the nature of the soul, and things like that. It's issues that concern climate and gender. Right, these are all also hot button scientific issues that clearly have significant overlap with faith concerns, and I think that's maybe that's a whole separate question, but certainly one that also needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and I actually think that just because I've spoke at so many different youth minister events in the last 10 years, and ones that are very much evangelical to mainline Protestant ones and such, that the questions of religion and science for teenagers growing up in a congregation are much more important than their parents are willing to admit. Yeah. Right? And they are going to pick up on what the congregations' intuitions are on hot button ethical issues. And that's all well and good. And teenagers will change their mind 10 times before they're 20. So you can decide to enforce one, but that's not the most fruitful way of doing it. But when it goes to whether or not you can call God creator in a world that's 13.8 billion years, and you have all the information of evolution sitting there right in front of you, chromosomes that hooked together a while back, and your answer is, odd. Like, there are, if you don't address a basic kind of religion science literacy, then the assumptions that are going to be brought in to teenagers that are being formed are really detrimental to basic affirmations around God, and I don't think they're necessary. And I just know there's very little resources there. So when I was working with students and college students and in high school students, I regularly had to do religion and science stuff and didn't have high quality resources around. And then once my peers found out I did it, I've done a number of retreats where there's bunches of youth groups there, because those kind of basic questions ministers feel inadequate. And part of it's theological education, right?
Yeah,
that you get an MDiv, but when I ask you, like, what are the basic ideas of Darwin, you're like, there's an ape. And so yeah. Like when you are in a position that both deals with undergrad students, is working with church, and a foundation that's working on kind of education in the academy and the church, if you could wave a magic wand, and put a class or an item on the agenda of churches or seminary, seminary, like required course list and things, what from your work, where would you want to begin?
In terms of providing kind of science literacy within the church community?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think the scientific issues that vex people, just change over time. So, for example, what's the biggest scientific issue on the table for the church community right now, today? I think it has to be CRISPR, right? Gene editing, germline gene editing is sort of the topic that everybody is all abuzz about. And if you ask the average member of the Christian congregation, well, what does gene editing mean exactly, and what sort of possibilities does it open up? Honestly, I think they have very little idea. So, and who knows what it'll be tomorrow, right? That's what it is today. And so if there was some way of providing basic science literacy for the church community, but not in the sense of providing the sort of education that students are supposed to get in primary and secondary school. Shouldn't be the church's job to do that, but to provide them with an opportunity to think through what the implications of these different basic sciences are. That's important. So, I myself, I find astronomy and cosmology interesting, and I find quantum physics interesting. But if it was up to me to decide on a curriculum that would be implemented in the churches, I think I'd start with these areas that are a bit more existentially central, thinking about issues in genetics, thinking about issues in gender and in climate. I think that's where I'd start, because I think that once you get people to the point of having an interest in the theological significance of these sciences, then their interest extends to other things naturally. If you're looking more at apologetic type questions, then I think issues that concern evolution and the problem of evil, and some of the things we've been learning, especially in recent evolutionary psychology, I think those are the most pressing issues that Christians need to work out. Right? I think the Christian community just hasn't worked them through yet, and we need to have a pipeline of Christians coming up through the ranks and maturing in their faith, who are thinking through these things and helping the community figure out how they want to address them.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I remember, I don't know, it was rather early on in the first church I worked at. We had a physicist that was a member of the church, and I had him come in, and I asked questions, and he tried to answer them in ways 16 to 18-year-olds didn't roll their eyes. One of the things he said at the end stuck with me and has shaped what I do when I think about ministry to students. Is he got done? He said, "And some of you don't understand most of what I said. Some of you understood some of it and thought that's nice. But maybe one or two of you are excited you don't know everything I just said and want to know. And I want you to know that being a Christian has animated and energized me learning all these things. And there's nothing about being a person of faith that should keep you out of the sciences. And I do think that part of a side effect from not wrestling intentionally with religion and science is that the most animated people that come out of our congregations whose faith most animates them don't naturally think that vocations in science are, viable callings and such.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's really unfortunate because I think that's a recent phenomenon. From the time of the rise of modern science, I think the Christian community has seen science as a calling because it's another way to learn about the Creator, and it's just a trite expression, but learning about God through the pages of His Word and the pages of His works are equally legitimate ways of knowing the Creator. And I think part of the problem is that science has become so detailed and so technical that sometimes it's hard for people to see through that and to see what the narrative is. Like, what is the story about what we're learning about the Creator from looking at the sciences? I think that's a really interesting question that more Christians should be talking about, and some are. But the word doesn't really seem to have gotten out. And, I think the other part of, there's also, I think, kind of pietistic movements that have taken over in some quarters of the church. And I saw this quite vividly when I was putting on a speaker series at Franklin and Marshall, and we had, there was a debate between Bill Craig and Paul Kurtz, I think it was. The guy, he's now passed away, but he's kind of a very famous new atheist guy. And so I said to some of the students on campus, we were reading some of their work, and I said, why don't we find some time to get together with these guys outside the context of their debate? And I just sensed that there wasn't really any interest on the part of these students who otherwise, like bright people. And so I said, well, guys, what's the issue here? Like, why don't you want to do this? And this one guy said, Dr. Murray, here's really the thing. We don't want to know about God. We want to know God. And I think he thought that this was something that was, I was supposed to be impressed by this. I said, well, don't try that on your spouse. Because knowing someone requires knowing about them as well, right? And so you want to do both. You want to know God and you want to know about God. And in these careers like the sciences, it provides you with another way of knowing about God and a way that you can share that with the rest of your Christian brothers and sisters. So I think if we could inspire a generation to see the calling of the science in that way, we'd be better off. And there are people like that. I mean, we had a speaker series at my church last year, and they they wanted to bring Jennifer Wiseman in. I don't know if you know Jennifer, but she was the senior project scientist on the Hubble Space Telescope, serious religious believer, and runs this big program now that helps to improve the science curriculum in seminaries. And they wanted to do this on a Friday night. They were putting out a lot of social media aimed at high school kids. And I thought, oh gosh, Friday night, like this is going to be a disaster. Like no one's going to show up. And this is a church that normally gets about 300 people. 750 people showed up. It was absolutely packed. Stayed for an hour and a half long talk, and then stayed around for another hour for just Q&A. And I think once they saw, look, this is somebody who has a way of illuminating the importance of scientific findings for our understanding of the cosmos and of God and our place in the world, they were really intrigued. And I think if we can incentivize more people who are in the sciences to be public intellectuals for the Christian community in that way, we would all be better off.
Mm-hmm. So when you kind of going back to the conversation about the NOMA or non-overlapping magisteria being part of the challenges to deal with, and then the assumptions then in religious communities that scientists have a certain biases or ideology at work in their work. Can you describe what the challenges are on the flip side? or in the non-religious public square, where you get the assumption of a kind of religion and science conflict type of model, or let's have a debate and it runs like a World Wrestling Federation type of battle?
Well, yeah. So there, I mean, I think there are a variety of challenges, but one is the religiously illiterate member of the general culture. I mean, of course, religious illiteracy is almost as pervasive as scientific illiteracy, and there what you find is people who are not or have not been part of a faith community just think, well, look, religious beliefs are just these beliefs that people hold without, in the absence of evidence, or sometimes in opposition to the best evidence that we have. And so there is going to be an intrinsic warfare between science and theology, because science is about drawing conclusions on the basis of the best evidence that we have. Religion or faith commitments or dogma or beliefs that we hold in the absence of or in opposition to the best evidence that we have. And so, of course, you've got this intrinsic struggle. And of course, the problem there is that people just don't get it. And so you see people like Richard Dawkins talking about faith as believing in the absence of or in opposition to the evidence.
Yeah.
And I was at this small conference at Oxford in 2010, and Richard Dawkins was on the panel at the end. And somebody called me out as a person who worked at the Templeton Foundation. So this was going to be, it was inevitable that there were going to be some fireworks here. But he said, look, I just don't understand what you guys are doing at the Templeton Foundation, because you claim to be championing science, but yet you're also trying to promote religion, which is just belief in the absence of evidence. And I said, I just don't know where you got that definition. I mean, you just made that up. And so he said to me, well, what evidence could there possibly be for a religious claim? And so I said, well, look, we'll just take a very simple one. Many religious believers think that God created the universe and designed it as a place where intelligent life would emerge, life that's capable of engaging in relationships of love and friendship, and both between the creatures and with God. And I said, what evidence is there for that? And I just gave him a sort of a basic fine-tuning argument. And he said, well, okay, that's evidence, and that would be evidence. And I said, yes, I agree, that's evidence. And he said, well, then that's not faith. And I said, well, that's what you've got wrong, right? So faith commitments are just commitments that we draw from our religious traditions. We might come to hold these beliefs on the basis of revelation or something like that, but that doesn't mean that there isn't additional evidence that we can bring, that we can marshal for or against those claims. Right. And so I think for just a brief moment, he got it. I think after he left the room, he forgot it. But I think if we can help people outside of these faith communities to see that when we talk about faith or we talk about religious convictions, we're not talking about things that are believed only on the basis of some supposed inspired text, right? But that there's other relevant evidence that we can bring to bear, and for and against. And that's where the challenges to faith come from as well, right? When we're entertaining reasons to believe that some of these claims are not true.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that story I think is illustrative of something on kind of both sides. Like, you can have a conversation and get, oh, I could see that as evidence, and understand that another answer or a response to this to the scientific evidence is plausible, and then realize, for Dawkins or for the religious apologists, that your tribe really doesn't want to hear that.
Yeah,
right. Like, there are reasons, even on so-called intellectual debates, that our minds, as they've evolved, are not that interested in going, no, here's a slice of plausible answers. I kind of lean this way for this way because of the answers over here that are, currently seem like the best guess, but I also are making those selections because I trust these religious experiences that I've had in this religious tradition. But if these things got falsified over here, I could see myself being right. And I think that for people who that critical investigation of the truth is an element or expression of their faith, that's not threatening. But for those who that type of investigation throws up in the air the viability of any of their experiences or faith they've had thus far, it is more. And it's not just religious people, because right, Dawkins has that experience with you, and then the next time he's on a debate stage, he hadn't changed what he said.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Because who gives him money, who cheers him on, who comes to his talks and all that kind of stuff are the people going to a revival so they can get saved again.
That's true. But, I mean, in all fairness, as I'm sure you know, you see the same vices displayed by some within faith communities as well, right? So this is one of the big frustrations I have with the intelligent design literature is that, I think the people who are involved in the intelligent design community, they're well-intentioned, they're bright people, but they too don't seem to be willing to listen when critics explain why some of the arguments don't work. They have a hard time responding to those criticisms, and yet they'll go up on the platform the very next week and they're giving you the very same arguments. And, it's that, and so it just makes you wonder, like, what really are the motives here? Is this just a career? And in order to keep the income flowing, you have to keep repeating the same line? Or are you just biased in such a way that leads you not to be able to see and appreciate what the arguments are that are a challenge to your own view?
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me about the kind of creation science into intelligent design thing that Kenneth Miller brought up was the evidence that they had gone in and found in creation science textbook all the places of creator, and then just auto replaced designer.
Yeah,
and that. That's well and good if that's what you think you're doing, but then to pass that off as if it's this is a scientific option as opposed to coming straight out of a faith commitment just seems odd.
Yeah, no, I agree. And now, having said that, I do think, and this is controversial, but I do think that there's nothing in principle that prevents us from drawing theological conclusions from empirical data. So it could well be the case that, it could be the case that intelligent design people are right. It's just right now they don't have any arguments that should persuade us that they're right. And there are states of the natural world such that if we were to encounter them, I think we would all draw the conclusion that some kind of intelligent design was at work. And they think they found that in these irreducibly complex structures and so on. But, if you and I were to look through the telescope and into the Hubble Deep Space Field and were to see an arrangement of stars with laser print quality spelling out the first chapter of Genesis in Hebrew, I think any astronomer would say, okay, something's going on here, right? There would have been some kind of intelligent agent that's intervened in the natural process to bring this about. And that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to draw. The same way that, the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, right? When the fire comes down and consumes the altar, everybody drew the same conclusion.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. One of the things about that I'm interested in how you see the relationship is, there is a sense that, what is or isn't possible and plausible and stuff in the relationship of faith and science is, fluctuates over time. Like, when we had a steady state vision of the universe, theologians that wrestled with science are real uncomfortable. Then, there's a big bang and they're like, T0, finally, creation out of nothing, which then if you overinvest in that and science has a different picture, or you start having a multiverse and things, you have to have whole nother conniptions. But there's that tension in the whole relationship of faith and reason. But how do you connect that with the tension that in some sense, faith exists at an existential register as well? And that, there's this metaphysical or scientific register. And as Christians or any monotheists that point towards history as places of revelation, there's a historical register or referent. But it also includes an existential register that impacts both how you do science, how you do historical investigation and things, but also how you give yourself and put yourself into the world.
Well, I guess I want to hear you say a little bit more about that. I mean,
what popped in my head about the seeing Genesis 1 at the end of a telescope, I was thinking of Kierkegaard in the sense of, if would you really want to know all the answers or not? If all the truth is laid out and that's ultimately compelling you to one final answer, then, why didn't God give compelling truth from the very beginning so you don't end up with a whole bunch of religious traditions with different things? Like, to me, it seems that a God of truth is also selected for as brought about a rather huge and beautiful diversity of different traditions and peoples and experiences. I mean, you even just give Protestants the text and then boom, and we got millions of denominations and expressions and stuff. And so the finality or the compelling of assent to some belief when it goes to ultimate reality seems problematic. And I could imagine, just like at the end of a telescope, you read the beginning of Genesis 1, you could watch Jesus give the Sermon on the Mount, feed 5,000 and go, I mean, he's not that bad for a prophet, but, where there's this, there's something that's getting itself done in the event where you come to faith. Like when Peter says, you're the Christ, Son of the living God, Jesus says, my heavenly Father told that to you. Not, evidence that demands a verdict. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that, first of all, someone can be a perfectly faithful Christian and not ever engage with the sciences at all, right? But for those who do, I think they are able to enjoy a gift that God's given us of exploring uncertain frontiers, and that's part of the joy of being a creature. Is that you come into the world not knowing everything, and beginning this journey of exploration that has many, many, many false trails, right? There's sort of what's sometimes called the pessimistic induction in philosophy of science, where, since every scientific theory that has ever been proposed has also been debunked, except the ones that are currently entertained, we should draw the conclusion that probably the scientific theories we have today are also all wrong. That can be kind of deflating if you buy into the so-called pessimistic induction. But I think what it points to is that this is a journey. In the same way that the cosmos is on a journey, we're on an intellectual journey to try to understand it. And as we do, perhaps we get closer and closer to the target. But having all the right answers and being certain that we have all the right answers really isn't the ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm. So. When you think of the questions around cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, and the origins of religious belief, how do you introduce that kind of contemporary debate to your undergrad students who, may have some awareness of evolution, but the idea that all of a sudden there's this intense debate about the origin of where religion came from, that's new news to them?
Yeah. So I think, the way I start the conversation about this is to point out something that I think once you see it is obvious, but it's also puzzling. So, wherever you go across times and cultures, human beings have been religious. They have accepted the reality of invisible agents that have an interest in human affairs and engage with human beings. And you also seem, as far as we know, where we have evidence from across times and culture, people believe in the existence of some kind of immaterial reality that's a component of the human person. So this commitment to something like dualism, this commitment to something like the existence of invisible supernatural agents, it's all over the place. And that's puzzling because there doesn't seem to be any clear evidence of that. Like, why is it that people have believed this across times and culture? You can see why when we open our eyes, people believe in the existence of, solid material objects because they see them with their eyes. But when you have this belief that's pervasive across times and culture, but for which there doesn't seem to be any immediate evidence, that's puzzling, right? And so you have to conclude that the reason people hold these views is because somehow our minds are structured in such a way that we're naturally drawn to these conclusions. And then the question is, well, what in the world would explain why our minds are configured in that way? Like, why are minds configured in such a way that we naturally gravitate towards believing in these invisible agents and invisible components to human nature? And, whenever you see traits, characteristics, properties that are recurrent across a variety of different environments, then it's reasonable to assume that these are the results of some kind of evolved process, that there's some kind of challenge in the natural environment to which organisms are reacting, and they latch on to a common solution. And so then that leads one to ask, well, is there some evolutionary challenge that human beings have encountered that led us to have these dispositions to form certain types of beliefs? And if so, what are those challenges, and how do these beliefs solve them?
Mm-hmm. So when you kind of do that investigation, what are the spectrum of dominant responses? Like, what are the most plausible kind of responses that I think get laid out really well in the book Believing Primate, where you have voices from all these different ways of kind of taking the same basic evidence and observations?
Yeah. So there are two different classes of response. The first is the first sort of response just says, well, look, you might assume that these dispositions to form certain kinds of beliefs have some adaptive value, and that's why we find them across times and cultures. But that's false. These aren't adaptations. They're byproducts of other things that are adaptations. And so we shouldn't go around looking for some kind of explanation in terms of enhanced organismic fitness. These are sometimes called byproducts or spandrels. And, so for example, if you put a moth around a candle flame, you'll see that they will spiral until they incinerate themselves in the candle flame. And that's a characteristic that you find amongst a number of different kinds of moths. Someone might say, well, if that's a common characteristic, it must be an adaptation, right? And the answer is, well, no, it's a byproduct of another set of traits that they have for navigating around light sources. Turns out it's maladaptive in this particular environment. And so some people will say, well, look, religion is like that. The disposition to form beliefs in these invisible agents and so on, that's the core characteristic of religion. That itself is controversial, by the way. But and they'll say that's a byproduct of other traits that we have, but it's not adaptive. In fact, it's harmful. Leads to things like 9/11 and so on. Then there are other views. There's really a class of adaptationist views, and on these views, these dispositions to form these beliefs in supernatural agents and gods and so on is adaptive. They are adaptive, and there the accounts begin to diverge because they provide different stories for how these dispositions are adaptive. So some will say that they're adaptive because it's useful for us to have what some have called hyperactive agency detection, right? Mm-hmm. When we're in an environment that's populated with predators, we should be especially alert to movements that or activities, states of the world that might signal that there are intelligent agents around. And so when we see the rustling in the bushes, we should worry that there's a tiger there. And it's adaptive to do that. Right? If we're wired in such a way that we think that there are these predators around, then we're going to be especially cautious, and that's going to lead us to be safe and to avoid being prey. But it's better to be safe than sorry. So it's better to have false positives rather than to have false negatives. And as a result, we kind of have this cognitive hair trigger. And what it leads us to do is to see certain kinds of movements and sounds and states of nature as indicating that they're agents even when we don't see them. So we see movements of the clouds, and we see thunder and lightning, and we see the shadows in the wind. And this hair trigger leads us to infer that there's some agents around. We don't see any, and so we naturally infer the existence of invisible agents. And that's the launching pad for religious cognition on one view. But there are other views. I'll just give you one other example. This is a view that's becoming increasingly popular, and that is that it goes like this. So as group size increases for any community of organisms, challenges emerge for how these groups are going to interact with each other, and especially when you have groups that survive and increase their fitness by cooperating, they face the challenge of how to maintain cooperation in the face of threats to defect. So it's always better for an individual in a community if they can derive the benefit without contributing the work. So if there's a way of cheating, then from an evolutionary standpoint, that's adaptive for you as an individual, but it's detrimental to the fate of the group. So organisms have adopted a variety of different ways of sort of sustaining cooperation in the face of these temptations to defect from cooperation. And as group size gets larger, the kinds of tricks that they need to evolve in order to sustain cooperation have to get more complicated. Mm-hmm. And so one claim is that one view is that religion emerges really as a tool to help sustain cooperation, because what religion does is it postulates the existence of supernatural punishing entities who are invested in human behavior and will punish defection. So morality is a tool of religion that's created in order to sustain cooperation. Religious agents are essentially the moral police, right? Who will punish you either in this life or in a future life for defecting. And so this is a useful tool that evolution has conferred upon us, this disposition to form beliefs in these supernatural punishing agents, because it incentivizes our continuing to cooperate. That's adaptive for us as individuals and as groups. And so you see this type of belief become pervasive across human populations.
Mm-hmm. And when you kind of are, how would you describe the activity of, one, the investigation of biological evolution, which is a theory that has a history, and then the construction of these type of, as if type of stories. So, right, like none of the accounts that you gave there are counterintuitive to evolutionary theory, but then what was the active part that made the emergence of religion make sense differs. So, biological evolution, when it starts to take shape in a human species that's social, that uses language, has technology and things, how do you describe that gap, that jump in the way, say, evolutionary psych or social biology connects to evolution as a theory around biology?
Well, so our cognitive capacities are biological as well. That is, they're byproducts they're the results of the kind of cognitive equipment that we have as a result of having the kinds of brains that we have. And so, we know that the cognitive capacities we have because of the kinds of brains that we have provide us with all sorts of other fitness advantages that don't have anything to do with police and cooperation and so on. But if one of the evolutionary challenges that we face is this threat of defection, which, if we were to succumb to it, would be harmful to our prospects as a species, then evolution either needs to help design a way of solving that problem, or the species goes extinct, right? So what that leads evolutionary theorists to do is to ask, okay, well, what sorts of solutions are available to this challenge to organisms that are around at the time that we're going through these adaptive changes, and is there reason to believe that the one that we see is one that's likely to have been selected for because of its adaptive advantages? So I'm not sure that maybe that's not really answering your question, but it's the same sort of reasoning that goes on when we're engaging in any kind of evolutionary reasoning about the characteristics or traits of organisms. It's just that these happen to be cognitive ones that are built on top of the neural architecture that we have.
So when you talk about those, the kind of growing popularity of religion as a solution to the freeloader problem, and that as our community groups grew and grew, especially after the agricultural revolution, you needed ways to have instruments of coercion inserted in people's minds, and community cost like that religion and stuff built. You start to tell stories like that, and you get a response that goes, "Oh, Tripp, Michael, it's great. Religion was excellent a while ago. It really helped human species evolve and survive to this point. And we should really congratulate religious traditions. Like, look, we got a bunch of them. Look, y'all done great job. Excellent. And we're going to need you to stop now. We've got science. It's going great. Like we can make lots of superhero movies and got plenty of myths you can use to discuss stuff with your kids. So the age of religion is done. Now it's kind of a problem because insert, whatever the most popular example is of backwards religion, the harm it causes, and that type of thing. And I know it feels bad, but y'all were awesome for like thousands of years. So congratulate yourself and let's move on. So
Sure.
And I know so many people that just assume that's the obvious conclusion to the science for a lot of reasons. And so when you think of that kind of presentation, what are the immediate places you want to begin a conversation, and how would you reframe it?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. So, sure, someone might say, well, look, we know that evolution generated these mechanisms that made religious belief plausible, and that was a really good thing because it solved a certain kind of evolutionary problem for a period of time. But now we know that those beliefs are false. And, of course, once you know that the beliefs are false, then obviously the belief in a supernatural punisher doesn't really do any work to thwart defection because you don't believe there is any supernatural punisher. So that wouldn't be a good thing. And then maybe you need to move on to something else. But there are a few confusions in this reasoning. So, but let me first of all say there are some people like the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson, who is himself an atheist, wrote a really interesting book called Darwin's Cathedral, which describes a different mechanism, a different way in which he supposes religious belief fosters cooperation in a way that's beneficial to human groups. And David says that he is a practical theist. And what he means by that is he thinks that we need to continue to support and champion the cause of religion because it's practically useful, even though he thinks it's theoretically false. And so he thinks that that's the only way that human cooperation can be sustained in the future is if religious communities continue to exist, even though theoretically he thinks it's false. So if you ask him, are you a religious believer or a theist, he'll say yes. But if you ask him to explain what he means by that, he'll qualify in a way that probably would lead most of us to say he's actually an atheist. So even some people who are atheists think that this is still really, really important and something that we just can't give up on. There's no other way to get the same kind of cooperation in human communities than what you get from religion. But let's say you don't hold that view. Obviously, if you come to hold that they're all false, then they can't play this. They can't play this role. But that leads to the question of why people conclude that they're false, right? So, and if you conclude that they're false because you think that religion is nothing more than an evolved disposition to believe, then you're just confused, right? And there are a lot of people who have this confusion. So I think that's, first of all, the question is why would somebody want to hold that these religious beliefs, which have all of these practical benefits associated with them, are false? That's what I want to interrogate next.
Mm-hmm. No, I actually, one of the other people in this series, which I haven't decided if this part's going in an interview yet, but I said after they presented the account, the evolutionary psych account of religion, and then said, look, it served for these adaptations. Early before agricultural revolution, you have hyperactive agency detection, and then those invisible agents become ways of gathering when humans start to gather in larger numbers. It serve these purposes, blah blah blah. But it's like, so why would you look at that history or just the history of your tribal deity called Yahweh and think it's smart to keep the big guy in the sky around because we know where he came from? And I said, yeah, but why, if you look at the history of a cosmos for 13.8 billion years and you see constants that are generative, the slow, creative development of greater complexity that then creates the possibility for more generative responses, all the way to some dead stars with a periodic table, the emergence of life, all the way to eye contact while making love, enjoying symphonies, and having this debate on a piece of technology that zooms us across a planet to discuss with every religious tradition in mind and all the sciences, questions humans have asked around campfires since the very beginning. What about that whole story makes me think that there isn't a patient and relational ultimate source of existence that is involved in that history, and it is actually a rational, selected account to say that this relational and open source of reality would have a universe that evolves this way if it intends us for a relationship. Like, I literally don't know what data isn't being affirmed by either one of us. It's just one of us is saying there is traction for the most basic human instincts that we have, the most human-making experiences we have, and is ready to tell a story that affirms that history, but is being transformed by the new challenges we face, like the questions around CRISPR or the ecological crisis. Like, I feel like the one of my biggest frustrations, I think, is why is telling that story one way or the other, one scientific and one theological, when none of the science technically changed at all?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good way of putting it. I think I would put it slightly differently, but not because I disagree with what you just said. I think, when you have critics of religion or Christianity who are pointing to these evolutionary psychology accounts, here's what they think. They think that because they've given you an explanation for the cause of these beliefs, that therefore there's no reason to hold those beliefs. That once you give the causal account, then you've undermined the justification for those beliefs. And that's mistaken reasoning. So, or at least under some conditions, that's mistaken reasoning. So if if you tell me that you see some yellow butterflies flying around in front of your eyes right now, and I tell you that an hour ago I slipped a hallucinogenic drug into your coffee that produces hallucinations of flying yellow butterflies, well, now you've got a problem, right? I mean, you've got an epistemological problem because you're uncertain about whether or not the belief you have in those yellow butterflies is caused by yellow butterflies or by a drug I slipped in your drink. And and so someone might say, in this case, well, look, if forming these beliefs in supernatural agents is a result of evolution creating dispositions it's just like a drug, right? It's just like putting the drug in the drink. And so we can see now we understand the cause of this, and so now there's no reason to believe it, just like there's no reason to believe in the yellow butterflies anymore. But that only works when the story you tell is such that the cause of the belief disconnects your belief structure from the target of the belief, right? So the idea here is that when I give you the drug in your coffee, I've severed the connection between the supposed target of your belief, the yellow butterflies, and the belief itself. But not every causal account severs the connection between the target of the belief and the belief itself. So let's imagine instead that it goes like this. God slips a drug in your drink that causes you to have God beliefs because God wants you to believe in him. Well, does that sever the justificatory relationship between the cause of the belief and the belief itself? No, right? Here, what's happened is the target of the belief is bringing about through a series of steps the belief, and it's one that's true, right? So, what I've claimed in the work that I've done on this topic is, if the Christian faith is true and God has designed the evolutionary process in such a way that human beings evolve the capacities to have religious beliefs, then we haven't severed the connection between the target of the belief and the belief. That connection is sustained. It has a circuitous route, right? But we haven't cut it. And furthermore, I think there are, and this is, I think, something you were pointing out, there are additional reasons to hold these beliefs that don't have anything to do with their causal genesis. So I might think that God exists because of the fine-tuning of the cosmos, or I believe the accounts of the resurrection of Jesus or something. None of that has anything to do with whatever these evolved dispositions are that I have to form beliefs in these supernatural agents. Totally separate, independent reasons. And we have to take those on board and consider them independently of any evolutionary account.
Yeah, one of the things that came to mind when reading The Believing Primate is that a way of describing the kind of the structure of the human that we have now in relationship to religion is that there is a kind of religious awareness that is innate to human beings, but it's not thematic in the sense that it locates you in any particular religious tradition or type of religious expression. And which I'm interested in for you, how that the evolutionary cycle or the history thing impacts or changes the way you look at the history of Christianity. Like, do you start to see the doctrines that we have, or the questions that animate the church, having an evolutionary history? And I guess to say underneath that is that I think too often Christians read Scripture and read the history of the church as if it's immediately obvious what's there, or like in a church history class at school, you'll tell the history of the church as if God's not involved in that history, and you're just reporting objective facts or something.
Yeah.
But if the whole emergence of religion is part of the God-world relationship and the structures that are there, isn't the history of Christianity something where we should expect God to be involved in some way or at play?
Well, for sure. And so let me make two comments in response to that. So the first is, given what we know about these supposed evolved dispositions to form beliefs of religious sorts, supernatural agents, and so on, they do seem to be generic dispositions. That is, they lead us to form beliefs about agents of some vague sort. But when we come to believe in these agents, we don't believe just in agents of some vague sort. They have a particular shape. We see them as demons or angels or jinn or God or Shiva or whatever, right? And so we've filled in a lot of additional details that aren't supplied by these evolved dispositions. And so that's either where our religious tradition is informing the beliefs that we have, or other sources of data are, right? So we come to believe that there is an immaterial, immortal, eternal, timeless God, because that's the sort of God that seems consistent with the story that we understand about the origins of our universe that requires some kind of a cause. Right? This is all sorts of additional information we're bringing to bear when we're trying to flesh out what the nature of these invisible supernatural agents are. And so there, I think we're allowing other facts about God and God's interaction with the natural world to inform how we understand who God is. So that's the first thing. But the second is, and this is somewhat speculative, so I'll just give just the very broad outlines of this. But there's some folks who are working in this space that think that that there's an interesting interplay between the development and spread of certain theological traditions and the specific kinds of psychological dispositions that we have. So Joe Henrich, who's a evolutionary anthropologist at Harvard, has been doing some work recently looking at the questions of the origins of what some people have now come to call weird psychology. So as we've done psychological research, it's become pretty clear that what things that we thought were human universals aren't, that they vary by culture and geographical location. So a lot of the studies that are done in universities on university students are done on students that psychologists call weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? They tend to come from certain kind of cultural settings. And there you do see a certain kind of uniformity in their psychological profile. But when you go to parts of the world that don't have those characteristics, you find that their psychology functions very, very differently. So things that we thought that universal turn out not to be. Just to give you one example, we tend, most of us have heard and so believe that our brain displays a certain kind of lateralization, so that linguistic function goes on in the left hemisphere but not in the right. And it turns out that's true for us, but it's not true. It's not a human universal. Places where, in parts of the human community where the number of words in their vocabulary is low, you don't get lateralization in the brain, it turns out, for example. So what Henrik has been interested in is, well, what explains the origins of weird psychology in places where it's found? Where did it come from? And he has this really interesting hypothesis in a paper that was just published, that it's actually the spread of Roman Catholicism is the source of weird psychology. And it's a really interesting mixture of kind of theoretical explanation and historical work that shows that as Roman Catholicism spreads throughout the world, so do these psychological dispositions that we now come to think of characteristic of weird psychology. So here's a way where the history of the church shapes how humans think in a much more refined way. He thinks it's actually the stepping stone towards the emergence of both liberal democracy and modern science, interestingly. He's not a religious believer. He's just a guy who finds these questions interesting. So I think, right now we think about this scientific conversation happening at a very generic level, right? Here's the origins of supernatural belief in supernatural agency. But I think as this work continues, we're going to see that recent evolution, just over the last 40,000 years, has continued to refine and shape human understanding in ways that draw on or are influenced by specific theological convictions.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really interesting, and it makes sense, because I think there's a way in which the social knowledge of any community, tribe, religious tradition, culture is a structuring element for all of our experience, and you're already socialized into it before you know how to say anything. And so that's like the world already has the narrative and assumptions laid over it that you have.
Yeah. Yep.
So I'm interested, like, when you think of that, why, or if the Christian picture of God as, one who invests God's self in particular people and relates them over time, always relating both to their context, in the sense that, God didn't show up and tell Abraham and Sarah, like, look, I'm triune. And that the revelation of God has a history and a development and that type of process. Well, why, if we think relationally that way, would we not want to investigate God's relationship with other cultures and traditions, and think that there's something to learn, gain, interact with, that we can't immediately assess when we just look at the ideas, because we're already inheriting assumptions, as example, like the weird psychology. Like, we are coming from a Christian structure of existence, and we may not understand all the embodied knowledge that exists in another tradition that is the fruit of a different trajectory of God in relationship to people and a history.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I think it cuts in a few different ways. So let me give you two sort of different narratives. So on the one hand, you might think, sure, human agents interacting with the environment that God created are going to form different sorts of beliefs. Maybe they're contradictory, or maybe they're just divergent, and some of those beliefs are going to have religious significance, and perhaps we can learn things about God from studying the religious beliefs of these other traditions, because they too have been interacting with the same cosmos that God created, with the same or perhaps different evolved dispositions for how to understand the world. Right. So there may be things that we can learn, theological truths that we can learn from these other traditions that aren't displayed in the pages of the Christian scriptures. That would be informative for us about the nature of God and about our relationship with God. And it's interesting, when you look at least what we think we know about the history of religions, there does seem to be a certain evolutionary trajectory even to religious beliefs. And so some folks have claimed that, especially those who are advocates of the supernatural punishment hypothesis, that what we tend to see is this convergence over time in the direction of what people call moralizing high gods, right? So the existence of these super powerful, perhaps just unique monotheistic type gods with moralizing tendencies. That is, they care about the moral behaviors of creatures. They tend to take action to enforce the moral behavior of creatures through punishment of various sorts and so on. It looks like this type of religious belief becomes increasingly common over human history, to the point now where the number of religious believers who believe in all other traditions that don't involve moralizing high gods are getting very, very small. And so you might think, oh, well, this is evidence that we're kind of just like in science, we converge on unique explanations for the world, and we come to think that those are true, right? They're getting more precise and closer. Maybe that's what's happening with religion as well. I think that's not an unreasonable way to look at the trajectory of religious belief. On the other hand, the critics will say, well, look, there are times when human beings will converge on a particular solution to an evolutionary problem, but that doesn't mean it's good or true or adaptive. And you can see this, for example, in the emerging health crisis around adult diabetes, right? So we have a disposition to like foods that are high in fat and high in sugar. And when you start putting sugary soft drinks around for everybody to drink, they start drinking a lot of them, and then really bad things start to happen. So it might be the case, going back to your earlier point, right, that there are adaptive advantages to belief in moralizing high gods, and that it become pervasive across human culture. But maybe it's like sugary drinks. It ends up ultimately causing us more harm than good.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really helpful. One of the elements for me in kind of thinking through religion and science and starting to understand more about the evolutionary history of humanity and religious traditions is it gives me a different disposition as a minister when I'm engaging across faiths, because I guess I assume that if God is like God's self-testimony in Jesus, and especially in his ministry, that God's been invested, relational, and coming and relating to people and traditions wherever God finds them.
Right.
And in a sense, to me, like I remember the first time I transitioned from seeing my one of my best friends in Los Angeles, who's a very devout Buddhist, is someone where you kind of learn the ideas they have or whatever their practice is, to realizing what if he's from a tradition where there's a conversation with the one I know and experience through Christ that I can now hear, and I wouldn't have heard it at any other point in history. And like, why would you? It's like meeting my wife's best friends from high school. Like that, it doesn't change that we're married and I love her dearly, and I would not trade my relationship with her for anyone else's, because I love being her number one and vice versa. But that doesn't mean there's not something like to be gained and learned, and hearing more about the mystery of this genuine other I know and call my wife. By meeting friends and people that have different histories and different relationships with her.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think to some extent we're beginning to see it's not syncretism, but advocates of contextual theology who are arguing that there are these lessons that we can learn from other traditions. And I think one place you see that, you brought up Buddhism as an example. I think that a lot of scientific work has shown, I think some of this is exaggerated, but a lot of scientific work has shown that certain kinds of Buddhist meditative practices do have substantial psychological and somatic benefits for human beings. And I think these are lessons that Christians can benefit from. There are forms of meditative practice that have been absent from the Christian community, but present in other religious traditions. And when Christians have internalized those and begun to practice them themselves, I think they have seen the spiritual fruits of those in their own religious lives. So, I mean, that's an example of borrowing of a practice as opposed to borrowing of a particular belief. But I think the same thing can hold when it comes to certain kinds of religious beliefs. Obviously, there are places where there are genuine tensions, right? But there are other places where one tradition simply doesn't speak to a certain question and another does. And by considering and perhaps adopting those alternative beliefs, I think one's own understanding of oneself and of God and the cosmos is expanded.
Mm-hmm. So there are two other questions I wanted to ask, and one of them has come up just in doing this, in recording a lot of interviews for the series, and part of it's just because, like I said earlier, I'm a preacher's kid, so I've always had the same preacher until I went to college. But a number of people that I've interviewed had experiences growing up or in their work where like the belief in a literal Adam and Eve was like a real big deal. Now, I just didn't grow up with that, so I've never, I didn't know that was a thing until I was told it was. But to me, like questions around like sin and the human predicament and stuff, like necessitating that seems odd, especially when you look at the history, like the history of evolution and what we know scientifically. Could you kind of like introduce how people hear and experience that topic, and what are some helpful ways science helps us frame and discuss it?
So you're talking specifically about the historical Adam issue for people that where that's an issue?
Yeah, like I guess I didn't hang out with the right people growing up. That in not thinking there was a real one never impeded me from reading Luke and thinking New Adam Christology made sense. Yeah. But to me, it just seems that that's a problematic. If that's a hill to die on, it really sets us up as Christians not to truly engage like evolutionary science and biology.
Yeah, you may be right about that. I mean, so first, I think that when Christians look at the Genesis account of human origins in Genesis 1 and 2, there are all sorts of reasons just on the basis of the text alone to think that these are mythological accounts. They're not intended to be historical accounts. And so all sorts of, gives us all sorts of license to interpret those passages in different ways. I think Christians who take the historical Adam seriously, though, are really more focused on New Testament texts than they are on Genesis. So there are things that Paul says in Romans or that Jesus says that seem to indicate that Paul and Jesus thought that there was an original human pair, or that we're all descended from Adam and Eve. And so that's more problematic, right? At least if you think those affirmations on the part of Paul and Jesus are theologically significant. And so I think for evangelicals who worry a lot about the historical Adam, I think that's one set of concerns. I think there are others. I mean, some of them worry about the problem of evil and trying to explain the origins of evil outside of the wrongdoing of some human, right? There are, I think, kind of serious theological issues that need to be taken seriously. And then the question is, well, what are the implications for evolution? And here at this, I think this is a very confused topic right now. So first of all, population genetics does seem to give us very strong evidence that there was an original community from whom we are all descended of a few thousand, perhaps up to less than 100,000 years ago, and that we can't find just a single pair from whom all Homo sapiens are descended. Right, that's the problem that arises from population genetics. But and so what does that imply for people who are dead set on historical Adam? Even people who are friendly towards evolution. Well, first of all, even if it's true, well, let me say this. I'm not sure what I think about the historical Adam. Let me just tell you that up front. But when I'm talking to people who think it's very important, here's what I say to them about the implications of science. So it is true that population genetics seems to indicate that the initial community from whom we descend, numbered in the thousands, not just two. But that's actually not inconsistent with the claim that all Homo sapiens alive today are descended from a pair that were among that community of a few thousand. So let me try to explain why that's what that means. So let's say you've got 5,000 Homo sapiens that exist 100,000 years ago, and they're breeding with each other. They have offspring. Those offspring are interbreeding with each other, and so on and so on. But imagine that there's think of them all as aligned along a horizontal line, and you've got two in the middle. We'll just call them Adam and Eve, and they obviously breed with each other. They have offspring. Their offspring breed with each other. But imagine that their offspring are quite fertile. And so as you descend down through the ancestral tree, what you find is that their offspring are interbreeding with the offspring of all the others and all the others and all the others, to the point where you reach a certain stage where all those who are alive, let's say today, if you trace their lines back, well, some of them trace back to those who are on the left side of the line, those are on the right. But it also turns out that they trace their lineage back to the two who are in the middle, because their offspring interbred with the offspring of all the others. And so it might be the case that for all human beings that are alive today, we can, in fact, trace our ancestry back to two people and lots of others, right, who are around at the time. Just like you trace your ancestry back to some people and wherever your ancestors came from, but lots of other people who interbred with those who ended up being part of your ancestral line. So it's not, strictly speaking, inconsistent with population genetics that there is a pair some 100,000 years ago from whom we are all descended. In addition, there's been some really interesting recent work done by this geneticist at Washington University, Josh Swamidass. He's a controversial character, but the work has been quite interesting. And what he has argued is, just on the basis of data from population genetics, it's possible even that there's a single pair from whom we are all descended as recently as 10,000 years ago. He makes a distinction between what he calls ancestral and genealogical Adam. But just technically speaking, in the same way that I just described, right, that there could be many, many, many people around at a given time, but we all trace our ancestry back to at least these two, that can happen in as recently as 10,000 years. So I think we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the historical Adam folks as holding views that are just strictly speaking inconsistent with the data of population genetics. I think those views are very unlikely. They're very improbable if you're just thinking about the sheer probability of the outcomes I just described. But, if someone thinks, look, but God revealed that that's the way it is, well, then what's improbable becomes a lot more probable.
Mm-hmm. So, I guess I just never... I've never been in even when I was Southern Baptist, no one ever thought that was a thing. Looking at if there was an original pair where related to evolutionarily, like how that helps the veracity or not of the kind of, the prehistory narratives in Genesis. That seems like a weird theological hill to die on.
Yeah.
And if we were talking about in relationship to science about the human predicament, the violence around in-group out-group issues are there, or like in nature, red tooth and claw that you point out, let's just give you that just so that you can sleep at night and now ask the other questions, but around evolution and such. But the story of scientific evolution tells means the kill list is huge. The extinction rate and the violence at the heart of it. So, how do you think through and raise that question? So before there was ever even a human species, and I guess this original pair walked around and named animals that have been eating each other for millions of years. How do you introduce that question in a scientifically informed but theological way?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, just back to the historical Adam point for a second. I do think that for many who embrace The idea of the historical Adam, as I said, it's not a matter of trying to make sense of the Genesis narratives. It's trying to make sense of certain New Testament theological claims that make dismissing the historical Adam more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. So I even though I think there are ways to navigate that, I do understand and appreciate the reasoning of people who hold that particular view. But then there's this other set of issues that you're raising, which was the subject of the book that I wrote, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, which has to do with the widespread, pervasive natural evil that we find in the world, and it looks like natural evil that predates the existence of any Homo sapiens, any agents that are capable of making moral decisions, and so. If you hold to a view that is, of course, been widely held by throughout Christian theology, that all sin has to be traced to the wrongdoing of some created agent, then you have a problem on your hands, right? Because it looks like there's lots of bad stuff going on before there's any wrongdoing going on. So unless you hold a view like Alvin Plantinga or perhaps C.S. Lewis, and think that the evil that we find in the world that predates the existence of human wrongdoers was caused by satanic wrongdoers in some way, then you have to come up with a different explanation for how an all-good God could permit the existence of this kind of natural evil. And I don't have a favored view on this. So I think if you're a process type person like yourself, I think you have available solutions that the more traditional monotheist does not have. But even for the traditional monotheist, I think there are ways of trying to explain the origins of evil that are satisfying, but depend on certain controversial assumptions. Mm-hmm. So in the book, I look at a few different options. One question we have to ask ourselves is, what is pain and suffering actually like on the part of non-human animals? This is the part of the book that's been the most controversial, unfortunately, I think. But one problem is we just don't know. Like, we really don't know what the experience of pain and suffering is like for non-human animals. We have good reason to believe, I think, that it's unpleasant in some way, but we really don't know whether it's at all like the sort of thing that we experience when we experience pain and suffering. But set that aside for the moment. I think there's good reason to believe that that the experience of pain and suffering that attends the sort of injury that embodied organisms are prone to may be the only way of protecting those organisms from physical harm. So, in the book I describe some experiments that were, I don't know if they were experiments, they were experiences of people that were reported by scientists working with people who have a certain kind of disease that prevents them from feeling pain in their peripheral digits. And they were trying to figure out ways to help these people from keeping them from harming themselves. Because when you can't feel pain, you tend to do things that would cause you injury without recognizing it. Mm-hmm. So they tried to create pressure-sensitive gloves, and they tried to create gloves that would create a tone or some kind of a light would flash if you were gripping something too hard or stepping on something with too much pressure. What they found is that when people wanted to accomplish a particular task, the light would come on, the sound would sound, and they just ignored it. There was something that they wanted to accomplish, and even though the signal was telling them this is causing you injury, they went ahead and did it anyways. And so it may just be that when you've got intentional agents that want to accomplish things and are embodied, the only way that you can keep them from harming themselves is to create some kind of a mechanism that causes pain and suffering to prevent them from inducing these kinds of injuries. And so perhaps the greater good for God's permitting pain and suffering of the sort that animals experience is it's necessary for their survival as organisms. I think there are other solutions out there as well, but I think these are the kinds of options that we should explore when we're thinking about theodicy in the context of animal pain and suffering.
Mm-hmm. And how does that reflection around animal pain and suffering in the evolutionary story impact the way you think ethically about, say, like factory farming or the consumption of meat and that type of thing?
Yeah. So, people have asked me that question, especially because of the one chapter in the book where I raise questions about the nature of the conscious states that attend pain and suffering for animals. And so, just to be clear, in that chapter, I don't actually make the argument that animals don't feel pain and suffering. I just say it's really hard to know what it's like given the scientific data that we have.
Well, you say? I mean, the way I read it was like we can't make the sweeping generalization that Descartes did, where our own consciousness and mind is this unique thing inserted into a mechanistic reality. But you also can't make an assumption that science supports an obviously attainable gradualism with complexity that makes the correlates of visible pain and suffering scale to human.
That's right. So before I address that, let me come back to the factory farming point. So it could be the case that the reason why we ought not to mistreat animals is because mistreating them causes pain and suffering. Could be that that's the reason why. I mean, if our mistreatment of animals causes them pain and suffering, that is a good reason not to do it. But even if they don't feel pain and suffering, that doesn't give us license to mistreat animals. If you're a Christian and thinks that these organisms are created by God and are created by God to function in particular ways, then our reason not to do it is because we're thwarting or disrupting the proper functioning of those organisms that God created. And so I think it's better, just from an ethical standpoint, to disconnect the question of pain and suffering from the treatment of other organisms, because there are other organisms that don't feel pain and suffering. I mean, I think we ought not to mistreat the forests as well. But it's not because trees feel pain when we cut them down. There's a totally different reason for that. All right, but anyway, coming to this other question, right? You know, one of the most puzzling things about the evolution of cognition is the evolution of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness. The fact that when we experience something, it feels a certain way. And one question that really hasn't been resolved is, what's the evolutionary value of the feeling of stuff that we experience? So we know, for example, there's this phenomenon called blind sight, and there are analogs for other sensory modalities as well, where people with a certain kind of brain lesion can perfectly well navigate around a room when they tell you that they're blind. They will report to you that they are blind, but you put them in a room with a bunch of obstacles, and they can easily walk through without tripping over anything. So the question is, what's going on there? And the answer is, well, obviously these people are blind in one sense. They're blind in the sense that it doesn't feel like them to see. Mm-hmm. But they're not blind in another sense, namely that they're able to internalize visual signals and to use them to navigate successfully. So in one sense they're blind, in another sense they're not. So the neuroscientists call this blind sight. So if we're able to navigate perfectly well, even if we don't think that we can see, what does the feeling of seeing add to our, what fitness benefit do we get from that? And the answer is we actually don't know. So when we think about, animals, we see, or non-human animals, we see that when they experience a noxious stimulus, something that's likely to cause injury, they react to it in the way we do. They, pull their paw away from the thing that's causing the injury. They writhe around. They make all sorts of sounds that we associate with the sensation of pain. All of those behaviors are either adaptive or they're byproducts of things that are adaptive, presumably, right? But what feeling goes along with them? It's hard to say, because the feeling doesn't seem to have any fitness benefit. Right? The feeling part doesn't. And so we just don't know how that figures into the equation when it comes to the behaviors that we see. We infer these pain states from the behaviors, but there's a gap in the argument here, right? We don't really know exactly what the connection between the two is. So we don't know where phenomenal consciousness starts. We don't know whether or not we're the only ones that experience it. I myself find it very hard to believe that only human beings have phenomenal consciousness. But if you ask me to give you the scientific proof that other organisms experience it, I don't think there is any. And
philosophically, I think that people could even ask the question around, like, how do you know other humans do? Right?
Like, sure.
Because one of the things that happens in scientific investigation of something is, you're always, anything you're assessing scientifically is always going to have some kind of objectified external referent, and there's something that it's like to be you that even a perfectly correlated brain scan isn't going to communicate, because it can't communicate your own experience of being you.
Sure. So, I mean, this is, what's called in philosophy the classic problem of other minds, right? How can we know that the patterns of behavior we see displayed even by other human beings indicates that they have beliefs and desires that are the source of these behaviors that we see? Because we can't see those, right? We can only infer them analogically because we know that we have them. And the question is that a sufficient reason for us to believe that others have minds? And there's a whole long philosophical literature about this. But at least we know this, that at least one human being experiences phenomenal consciousness, right? Me, I know that. I know that I do.
You've convinced me you do.
But what we don't know is whether or not any other organism does. The scientific evidence isn't clear.
So one question that popped up, like connected to that I was interested in how you would frame it is, in the same way we don't know like where consciousness begins, emerges, the shape of it, and what it looks like in biologically for less complex organisms. How does that impact the way you think about artificial intelligence or extraterrestrial intelligence, and the implications that would have for us thinking about the ethics of those type of interactions? Like, is there a way that an algorithm and a computer or a cloud gets so sophisticated at expressing itself, experiencing itself, that it's unethical to turn off the power? Or are there ethical should we see extraterrestrials that demonstrate some type of similar or more complex experience and consciousness of the world? Do they have, would they come with inalienable rights of sorts, or would they be negotiated rights like an animal? Sometimes a pet, sometimes supper.
It's a really good question. And so first of all, I think that when it comes to ethical issues, for any type of organism that seems to display pain-related behaviors, we're obligated to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? So we can have all sorts of philosophical discussions around these issues, but when we're uncertain, then the organism that it seems to experience pain behaviors gets the benefit of the doubt. We should presume that they do. So that's true whether it's non-human animals, terrestrial non-human animals, or extraterrestrial organisms. When it comes to artificial intelligence, I mean, that's it's difficult because we just don't know what consciousness is, and we don't know what's necessary in order for something to have it. So if it turns out that inorganic computing machines aren't capable of experiencing phenomenal consciousness, then we don't have this worry, right? But if we determine that they are, well, then again, I think those inorganic computing devices get the same benefit of the doubt as terrestrial animals and extraterrestrials. I'm genuinely uncertain about this question. I really don't have a theory of consciousness that I'm pretty confident is right. I do think that there are some really serious arguments that challenge physicalist conceptions of mind. Mm-hmm. And if those arguments are vindicated at the end of the day, then we're just not going to get artificially intelligent inorganic computing devices that have consciousness. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether those arguments are right. I know that no one has given a refutation of those arguments. And so until I see otherwise, I'm going to continue to be a skeptic. But again, I think once we see a machine that passes the Turing test, right, that seems to interact with us in a way that allows us, that doesn't allow us to discriminate between it and some kind of a human interlocutor, we've got to treat it as if it does experience just like we do.
Yeah. Well, I've had way too much fun talking to you. And